Hi guys, Janaka here from Multispective. Today I'm here to share with you our 51st episode where I interview Angela Legh. Beautiful story. She was raised in an abusive environment with very angry father who used to abuse her and her family members to going into a very, very toxic and abusive relationship. It was a familiarity to her. It was a sense of comfort, yet at the same time, she was unaware of the abuse that was actually happening at home. She was unhappy in her relationship. She'd been married for a long time and had kids with this man and felt like there was no other way around it until one day a wildfire burned her entire apartment down and she had to build from ground up with her family. And it was that moment that was very pivotal in changing her perspective towards her life going forward. And that was the moment she decided to leave that marriage, go through a messy divorce, but rebuild her life from there on. It's a beautiful story, a very emotional one. She talks about some details about the abuse, so trigger warning there for you. But stay tuned. Be inspired by the wonders she's got to offer from her journey and how she's taken all the anger that was around in her life and turned it into something so beautiful. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe. Drop a comment letting us know. Every single comment that you send us is feedback for us to do a better job for you. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Angela, welcome to Multispective. I am so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here and just chat with you and see how we can uplift and empower your audience.
Most definitely. I feel like you have such a story. You've been through so many different waves of adversity. And I think again, it's one of those reminders of what life really looks like. It's like, you overcome one hump and then another one comes along and it's just like these little waves. But then the beauty about you.
Yeah, it's a roller coaster. Life is a roller coaster.
It really is. But you have really turned this adversity into a huge success story. And I think our listeners are going to be able to take so much away from this. And so I can't wait to sort of unravel this journey of yours on air. I'd love for you to maybe start from the beginning. Where does your story sort of begin?
Oh gosh, I was born in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco and lived there until I was 4 or 5. I had a very abusive father. He was an alcoholic and his self-hatred came out and was projected upon his kids and, just was exploded when he was drunk. So a lot of my childhood was kind of like, how do I hide from this? How do I not be seen so that I don't be a victim?
Right. Yeah. So in a way, it's starting from your father being abusive. The way that you took it as a child was to hide, to be as invisible, to make yourself as small as possible so you would not be the next target.
Yeah, pretty much.
Do you have siblings?
I do. I have 3 sisters. And I have one younger. She was, the baby, so we all kind of protected her as best we could. And then my older sister, she had to take a lot of the brunt of the abuse because she would stand up for us. As much as I experienced, she experienced more.
Right. It's interesting how you were able to kind of observe how your siblings and your other family members were handling this kind of situation. Everyone took it and handled it very different. Some got louder to sort of be a wall. Some were protected, Do you feel like you watched kind of your sister and became the way you did because you saw the way that your sister was being treated?
I've never been asked that question, and it's food for thought, right? I think that my whole mission in life right now is to understand what children are going through and empower them to overcome the adversity.
I love how where you are now, where you stand now, and we'll give you a chance to tell our audience a little bit about that. But I love how the sort of inspiration for you was turning into helping little children, because I think the way I definitely agree with you on a lot of ways. I always see that a lot of the reasons why people experience or make certain decisions as an adult, it always comes from their childhood trauma. So it really starts from the beginning. Yeah. Tell me about your mom and in all of this.
So my mom was the light in our life. She was the one who showed us love, showed us what love was, and did her best to keep the family whole and strong. But she was also the one who had to go to work because my father was not a very good provider. And so my parents divorced when I was 10 years old, which was a liberation. A lot of children see divorce as, oh, what did I do to drive my parents apart? Or they'll look at it as, I don't get to see mom or dad. For me, it was like, oh my gosh, I don't have to see dad anymore. And that was very liberating. But my mom, she got to that point after she had so many calls from the kids in like after school in the daytime. Dad's doing this, dad's doing that. And she couldn't stand the pull between her responsibilities at work and her responsibilities to her children.
Right. Yeah, no, I can imagine that being really difficult. For you guys, what was some of the kinds of abuse that you were facing? Was it very physical or was it more emotional?
It was more emotional. One of the things that has come to my understanding is that there's a good chance that I was sexually abused as a very young child and I repressed it. And sometimes those experiences, because it's so traumatic, it becomes like it happened to somebody else, or it's, you disassociate from that experience. So I have no memories of it. And yet I have like a knowing that that probably happened.
That's so interesting. How did you come to understand that or feel that or know that?
It's interesting. My current husband, when I first met him, he asked me if I had been sexually abused. I don't know. He says, well, you're carrying that energy. I'm like, okay, let me explore that.
Wow. So your husband was able to tell that this had potentially happened to you. Was it in sort of like your demeanor, the way that you were handling, say, intimacy?
Not especially. It was the level of my voice, because he's a former doctor, and in his practice, he noticed that ladies who were sexually abused, their voices were higher.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
What about, did you ever speak to your sisters about that?
We have never talked about that. The thing is that, like, one sister is so disassociated from her emotions that she doesn't even want to talk about anything. My older sister, we probably could talk about it, but I haven't broached that subject with her.
No, yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you've just sort of been around each other on a very different kind of level, that dredging up something like history is just, it's not only painful, but it's kind of re-traumatizing, and you're listening to parts of the story. Yeah.
And so it's not that I fear to tread there. I don't want to cause, in fact, as we're talking on this podcast, I'm like, I wonder if my sisters are going to hear this. I don't know.
Yeah.
And if they do, it would have been better if I said something, beforehand, but the cat's out of the bag. So.
Hey, maybe this might just start a conversation,
You never know. Yeah.
Do you think that processing and reprocessing trauma, or talking about trauma, and I ask this because you've done a lot of podcasts where you've talked about your childhood, does it get easier?
Yes. And, one of the things that I teach is how to be with your emotions, because what I realized from my father is that he drank because he didn't feel like he was a good person, that his father had instilled in him that he was a loser. So he lived up to his father's expectations, but he couldn't live with himself in that expression of his life. So he drank. And that numbing of emotions through alcohol or drugs or self-harming or overeating or bulimia or anorexia or shopping or gambling or any of these addictions or behaviors that we adopt to numb ourselves from the pain of our emotions. And the thing is, an emotion is energy, and it only takes about 2 minutes for the full cycle of the chemistry of an emotion to flow. But our minds get caught in the circumstances. And so our minds revisit the circumstance and bring the emotion up again and again and again and again. If we can disconnect our mind and just focus on the emotion, it can flow. And how I teach that is focused attention. You just focus on how you're feeling. And you put all your mind on it, like, where is it? What does it feel like? Is it sharp? Is it a dull pain? Is it crunchy? Is it, explosive? How does it feel? And when you're doing that, your mind is not focusing on the circumstances. And so that at that point, you're giving yourself permission to feel. And that giving permission to feel is life transformation.
Yeah. How long did it take you to get to this sort of place?
I had a friend who was doing energy work on me, and she would be like, "You have to feel this." And I'd be like, "No, I hated that feeling. I don't like it." And so, yeah, she introduced me to the idea that it's okay to feel a feeling.
I really, really like that. I think that's such an interesting way to look at it, because I know for myself, and I'm sure there are a lot of other people out there who feel like the start to healing is revisiting the actual circumstance. And while it may help to go there to trigger that emotion, it's really important to move from that moment to that emotion and then start the healing from that point.
Absolutely. The Body Never Lies by Dr. Alice Miller is a book that talks about severe childhood trauma and repressed feelings. She says that you cannot heal it until you feel it. And so, what happens with children who are abused, they don't have a voice in what's happening to them. They don't have a voice. They don't have the ability to say, "Hey, this isn't right. You shouldn't be doing that." So they end up hiding how they're feeling and disassociating from their own body when things are happening to them. And in those situations, so when a circumstance comes up in their life that triggers that memory that is still buried in them, then they are reactive not only to what's happening in front of them, but all that history of their emotion. So they need to be able to express how they felt about what was going on. And I didn't do that until I was, 55, I think.
Wow.
Yeah. But I screamed at my dad. He died in 1990. So I, felt pretty good about being able to scream at him for what I went through.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can you tell me about what was life like after your mom and your dad got a divorce, and I suppose you and your siblings moved to stay with your mom?
Yeah. So we moved from San Francisco, a very metropolitan area, to Sonoma County, which is just 60 miles north. And it's a beautiful place and more rural than than I grew up in. So it was a shock to move into, Cowtown of Petaluma. And so life was, there were less crises happening. It was easier. And we were financially constrained because, my mom could only earn what she could earn, and she had 4 kids to support. So without state aid, we wouldn't have made it, but we did. And her choice to take us away from the emotional abuse of my father was probably the best choice of my young life.
Did your mom ever find anyone else?
Nope. She's very Catholic. And so she was like, if I marry anyone else, I will be an adulterer by the church. And so basically she had a boyfriend for a while, but she did not marry again. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for her. Did any of you ever try to encourage her to find someone else or, move on and, have the life that she could have had for herself?
My mom's she's a devout Catholic. And so it would have been, I don't want to say useless, but I wasn't going to change her mind on how she thought about the fact that she divorced my father. And I just let her live her life and didn't try to introduce her to anybody or anything.
What was it like navigating romantic relationships for you thereon?
I never knew. Well, I remember in high school thinking, I don't even know how to talk to boys, because I didn't have that kind of relationship with a father and I didn't have brothers. So I just felt so awkward talking to guys. Ended up right after high school, I married a man who was older than me. He also had a very traumatic childhood. But what I learned from my childhood was that anger is something no one should have to experience. And so I was never going to get angry. What he learned from his childhood is anger gets you what you want. So I'm going to be as loud as I can and as vociferous as I can to get what I want. And I think it's so interesting looking back on that relationship about how these childhood decisions about someone else's behavior created our later behavior in life.
Like without even knowing it, maybe it was like you.
Oh, yeah. No, I would not have even said that 12 years ago. Because I was so unaware of my emotions and unaware of these motivating behaviors. And it's only been since I became more awakened that started, making more sense to me.
Do you think to an extent, though, that there was a level of comfort or familiarity that made you go and choose a partner that was so reflective or just mirroring that you've known of?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is a pattern of behavior that many people who experienced abuse in their childhood, they kind of get stuck in that pattern. And I remember it was like these cycles of, I left that marriage, and that's a whole story in itself. And then the next boyfriend was dismissive and not communicative. And so that was another aspect of my absent, not loving father.
Right.
And I did notice in my life that cycle repeating, but it got less and less. And I realized that it was the more I learned self-love, less I repeated that behavior.
Yeah.
Which is really, that's a hard thing for someone who learned that they were worthless as a child. So I can't, I cannot express to the audience enough how important it is to value yourself.
Yeah. And you know what? I can imagine it getting even harder because not only did you experience this as a child and you're having this battle that you're already facing where you're not loving yourself, but then you go into one relationship, two relationships, where if there's anything that's coming out of it, it's like they're validating the lack of self-love or they're validating that fact that you're not useful, right? How you break free from something like that is really, it has to be something from really deep within. There is no external factor that can help you get there. Not that there is no external factor, but
right. In my case there was.
Yeah.
So let's go into that because the audience is probably like, what? So I did get married at the age of 20 to a man who was 32. Stayed in that marriage for 33 years, even though it was somewhat abusive. It was very emotionally abusive, never physically abusive. I probably would still be in that marriage if a wildfire had not destroyed our house. And that happened in 2017, Sonoma County. There was a terrible wildfire called the Tubbs wildfire. And overnight it destroyed 5,000 homes, one of which was ours. That, having that rug pulled out from under me, put me into what I call a dark night of the soul. And I started questioning if life can shift in 10 minutes, if you can go from a homeowner to homeless in 10 minutes, why are you living a life that you're miserable? And so what I ended up doing is talking to a psychologist. I talked to a life coach, and I basically just continued to ask these deep questions. What do I want from life? Who do I want to be? Is this the life that I want to live for the rest of my life? And the answer, it was a resounding no. I didn't want to live that way for the rest of my life. So I ended up, it took me 6 months, but I did end up leaving that marriage. And I started really a long healing journey, just trying to understand, why was I reactive in the way that I was reactive? Why did I allow myself to be treated in that way? And really, if the fire didn't happen, I wouldn't have asked those questions, and I wouldn't have decided that I wasn't living the life that I was meant to live.
You were married for quite a long time.
I know. Yeah, a very empathic person. And I had this general idea that everybody deserves love. And so I stayed because I didn't want to hurt him. And it wasn't until after I left that I realized that I was giving love to everybody except myself, because I was not choosing my needs ever.
Yeah, I was about to actually kind of interrupt when you said everybody deserved love, because I was like, where do you fit in that equation?
Thank you. Yes, I know.
No, and in a way, I think by doing something like that, you're relieving the other person of an unhappy, toxic marriage too. And I think we often lose sight of that, because we think that if we stick around, we are giving that person a life that they need. But, you know, when you step out of it, you're like, actually, I've saved this person, you know, from being so unhappy for so long as well, right?
Yeah, and the burden of the judgment, because I judged his anger, and now he's free of that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, but I just, it must be so difficult, especially like at a point where like you're losing. It's almost like you have to go from one rock bottom to another rock bottom to another one for you to be like, oh, hold on a minute. Like, I have no choice now but to reflect. And to, you know, this is the thing, this is the beauty about like this world, right? I mean, this life, it's like the lesson has to be taught. And if you're not learning the lesson that's being given to you, well, then something else is going to happen for you to get there. You know, it's like,
First,
I'm
the
helping
angels are
you.
going to whisper in your ear.
Yeah.
And if you're not listening to that, they're going to tap you on the shoulder. And eventually they're going to get to the point where they have to take a baseball bat and bash you. And that's what the fire was for me.
Yeah. No, 100%. So when this all happened, can you walk me through how did you decide to leave the marriage and end it?
Oh boy. Okay. So after the fire, we went and lived at his mother's house for 6 weeks and had to share like a little bedroom with a little twin bed. And that was pure hell for me. After that, we moved into a 900 square foot house, and that was better. I had a little breathing room, but that wasn't enough. Then we ended up purchasing a 4,000 square foot house. And then I had enough breathing room. And what I realize is that being in the same room with him would bring my energy down. I realized this right before I left, that when he walked in the door, my stomach would drop because I didn't know what to expect from him. I walked on eggshells constantly. A few months, maybe a month before I left, my massage therapist suggested that I read a book called The Narcissist's Worst Nightmare. And I was shocked by that book. I saw my life in the pages. And well, I'll tell you the one thing that sealed the deal. The weekend before I left on I think it was a Monday. So the weekend before, his childhood best friend and his wife came to visit. And my former husband treated me so well during that weekend. And after they left, the next morning I said, why is it that you can treat me so well when your friend is here, but you don't when they're gone? And he said, I can only wear that mask for so long. And I was like, oh my God, that's like the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me. And that sealed the deal.
I just want to like sort of go back, and before we talk about the actual ending, in what ways can you give me some more examples of like how it was sort of toxic? How was he treating you badly?
I don't like revisiting these, but I remember that we were going to visit my daughter. She was in college, and it was a 6-hour drive. We were supposed to leave at noon, and he was delayed at work and came at 2 p.m., loaded our son, up in the back seat and started driving. He was vociferously complaining about this guy at work who made him late. And he was talking about how he could physically injure and kill this guy who made him late. And I said, our son is in the back seat. Please tone down what you're saying. And for the next 6 hours, he screamed at me for not supporting him. And then 2 days later, on the way home, he screamed at me for another 4 hours about the same thing. That was the kind of behavior that I allowed myself to experience.
Did you ever try couples therapy? Or did you ever encourage him to check and do some therapy?
One of the problems with couples therapy is both people think it's the other person's issue. And that was definitely the case in our, and I was in so denial. I had no idea how my childhood was influencing my triggers, emotional and behaviors, that I really did think he was the problem. And I could probably say the same for him.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious as to like your children. You're well out of that situation now. Have you spoken to your children post that?
Oh, yeah.
And the effects that it had on them?
So my deepest relationship is with my son, who is my biological son. My stepdaughters, it was awkward for a while, and they had a hard time connecting with me. And I realized at some point in time that they were probably angry with me because they had always had me in between them and Dad. And so they had this buffer zone trying to keep them from experiencing that raw anger energy. When I was not there, they had to experience it. Who could blame them for blaming me?
How did you notice he was very different with you and your son versus his own daughters?
No, he loves his children, and he would never purposefully harm them, but he doesn't understand emotions, and he doesn't understand how his behavior harms others.
Right. Walk me through that day that you decided, I'm done with this.
So that day, 2 days before, I had transferred some of our insurance money into an account in my name only. And I changed the password on our online banking so he didn't see that. I went grocery shopping, and I came home, and I sat on the couch across from him 40 minutes trying to work up the nerve to tell him I was leaving. And finally I stood up and I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving. I was surprised I have to preface this by saying that he lashed out at others when he was hurt. And so I had no idea how he would behave when I chose to let him go. So I packed a suitcase and I walked out the door and I left. And I went to a friend's house and stayed there for a night and cried. And there were a lot of days filled with crying because I felt like a failure. I tried to love him as best I could, and I tried to help him understand how his behavior affected others, and there was no room for that.
Do you know where he is now and what's he up to? Is he seeing anyone now? Like, well, I just wonder if
I don't
it
know.
did actually.
My son rents the downstairs apartment in that 4,000 square foot house. And so I know that he's still there. I don't know if he's seeing anyone. I wish him the best. I still love him. And I just know that I cannot be with him. And, I'm remarried. So, so it's a done deal. Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd left him, and that was sort of like your very first sort of step towards your personal healing journey, but you found yourself in another relationship. Yeah.
Not soon. It was my first act of self-love, choosing myself over someone else's needs.
Yeah.
And that was a very powerful realization that, it's okay for me to choose myself.
Yeah.
And my needs.
When did it go from being like an outward motion of like you taking the actions to self-love to actually internalizing that?
I think it's still a process that because what is self-love? It's honoring your needs and your wants and your heart, and it's not putting other people in front of you, but you can still love humanity and love yourself. It's just that you're not going to save humanity at your expense. And so that saving others at your expense was that where I was before. And after I left the marriage, I grew into, okay, I can love myself and love others. I just don't need to let go of who I am in order to make a relationship work.
Yeah. Yeah, this reminds me of a conversation I had with a really good friend the other day who talked about, he's such an empath as well. Like every time we would catch up, he would just talk about like his care towards like the world and making the world a better place. But I've seen that growth in him as well, because I've known him for a really long time. And he talked about, I need to be able to do enough self-care for myself so I can give the world. So I need to look after myself.
You cannot give from an empty cup.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that, because I think that was like a wake up moment for me as well, realizing that, hey, like it is okay, for example, to say no to somebody if you just simply don't have the capacity for it, because you're also not going to be able to help the other person quite as much if you're not in that good sort of headspace yourself.
It's also just knowing that when you're coming from your heart, you're in service.
Yeah.
But you don't have to cut out a chunk of your heart to do that.
Yeah.
You can leave your heart whole and be in service.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also the fact that other people are generally more open than you think they would be. So what I mean when I say that is if somebody's calling out for help, and if you were to turn and say, I love you, I care about you, I'm here for you, I just don't know if I would be able to give you the help that you need right now. Give me 2 days or 3 days. Right. I'll call you back. Most people are pretty okay with that. They understand that.
Right. One of the things that is so obvious to me is how we project our own stuff onto other people. When you're an empathic person, the burden of carrying your own problems and someone else's can get so darn heavy. And that's what I did all throughout my marriage. He needed me so that he could feel calmer because I would absorb that
Right.
energy. And I think the last thing I ever told him, and this was after I left him, was that I couldn't take his energy anymore.
When did you start? Did you ever sort of start therapy? You talked about energy healing. Can you walk me through all of those, processes?
All the different things.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I saw a psychologist first, and she was very instrumental in helping me see, because one of the things, I don't really want to go into this because I don't want to embarrass my former husband, but one of the first clues to me in our marriage that there was a toxicity problem was when he was screaming at my 2-year-old about how he held the fork. I told my therapist this, and I said I should have left him then. And she said, yes, and what would have happened if you did? How much time would your son have been alone with him when he's angry? How much time would your son have not had you to intervene on his behalf? You made the choice that you made with the information you had. And you cannot second guess that. She's very wise.
Yeah. I love that. This was sort of more on the therapy side, right? The psychology.
Yeah, so that's for your head, right?
Yeah.
Energy is really about moving the emotions because emotions are energy. The energy healing was I would do Zoom calls with this woman that I met through Mind Valley, and she would move the energy as, she would tell me basically to stay in that emotion, and then she would work to move the energy. That provided some profound healing space for me. But I got to the point where I'm like, shouldn't I be able to heal myself? Do I have to rely on others to move my emotions? I don't think so. So I took a course on energy healing for 3 years called Mastering Alchemy. And I did the exercises, and I let go of a lot of victim energy in doing that course. But also I learned about victim energy and what is the first place I heard of the victim triangle, which is a concept that people kind of have a hard time with. So the concept of a victim energy triangle is that there's the persecutor, there's a victim, and then there's the rescuer. And how does the rescuer add energy into the victim triangle is by seeing the victim as a victim and needing to rescue them. So they're adding to the energy triangle with that expression. And I talked about when I was living in England, because after the fire, I moved to England for a year, which was fun. But I was talking about it with a group of people, and a psychologist was there, and she's like, wait a minute, I can't rescue kids who are being abused by their father. And I said, no, but you must understand that if you're in a grocery store and you see a child being physically abused by the father or mother, and you intervene, that child is going to get in that car and go home with that parent. And from my experience in intervening for my son, the hurt parent, the one who is attacking, is going to double down when they get home. So is your intervention helping or hurting? I mean, if you can physically take them away and get them out of that, then yes, that's a good intervention.
Yeah.
But if you're, just trying to stop a behavior in a moment, just know that that behavior will continue when you're not there.
Yeah. One of those things where the intention is good, but what can be the after effects can be way more devastating.
Yeah.
But it's also really hard to just sit back and watch something like this happen.
Right. You can't. So what I tell kids in my children's books is that when you see a conflict, you send love to both sides of the conflict. And that opens up the opportunity for each side of the conflict to choose love. And the more people we have on this earth who are sending love to people in conflict, the less conflict we'll have.
I really like that.
Don't pick sides.
Yeah.
Just love them all.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very, very difficult idea to sort of actually put into practice when you're right in the midst of someone bashing you, potentially physically hitting you. How do you send love to someone like that, especially when you've never been raised in an environment where you were taught that?
I don't want your listeners to think that that is what I'm suggesting.
Right.
Because when you're in it, all you can do is survive.
Right. Yeah.
And when you're away from it, then you can have time to be introspective and make other choices. But if you are in a situation where you are victimized by someone else, then survival is the only thing you can do. You can't choose higher consciousness. Oh, well, I know he's projecting his behavior onto me, and so I'm just going to tell him, I'm your mirror. It all goes back to you. No, that doesn't work when you're in it.
Fair enough. Now, I'm really intrigued as to how have you delivered this message in your books for little kids to sort of understand?
In the first book, which is Bella Santini and the Land of Everlasting Change, there is a chapter in which Bella ends up in an alternative land, and that alternative land is peopled by emotions. And so sadness drops on her at one point, and fear drops on her at another point, and anger drops on her. And so as she's maneuvering through this world, she's talking to her compatriot, and they're giving each other advice about how to get through the different feelings. And then another chapter later, when they get back to the school, the whole group of friends are talking about, oh, well, my dad used EFT tapping and my mom used breathing techniques. And she says that box breathing will calm your nervous system. And so it's really about opening up awareness that you don't have to be victim to your feelings. You can face them and you can accept them, knowing that you have tools to get through them.
Wow. Some very complex concepts here explained to little kids. I can imagine. I'm really interested in this because I myself am a teacher. I teach little kids.
Do you?
Yes.
Oh,
I teach grade
fun.
2 kids. They're 7 to 8 years old. And they really are like a blank slate. At this age, they've picked up on only 5, 6, 7 years of things. So, the whole world is just opening up to them. There's just so much newness.
And they don't have, in general, they don't have the same burdens of what I call the filters and perspectives that parents, teachers, religious leaders, other adults in their life kind of hand over their worldview to the child, and the child believes it belongs to them.
Yeah.
And that happens more and more as they get into the teen years.
Yeah.
And at 8 years old, they really are kind of pure of that.
Yeah.
And so, if there was childhood trauma, they are carrying some of that burden. But for the most part, if they had, decent parents who loved them, then at age 8, they're wide open and able to. I think kids can really grasp these concepts. I think it's harder for the parents who are carrying those filters that they got from their parents and everybody else.
Yeah. I think that, I don't know whether this is a cultural thing, but I do think that over here in China, I live in Shanghai, China, the concept of emotions is still fairly new to these kids. They do understand it, but I think it's just not talked about enough, or it's not explored enough too much. So they struggle sometimes to put words to their emotions, or to learn how to express those emotions.
Self-expression is so important.
Right.
And expressing emotions is part of that self-expression. So there's negative emotional expression, which we've all experienced, where someone's lashing out at us. Equally, the repression of emotion. So when your parents told you, don't cry, or they told you, hey, young men are not supposed to show emotion, they're supposed to man up. And these messages taught you that emotions aren't supposed to be felt. But when you are self-aware enough to understand your own emotions, you're in control of your emotions. You're in control of your reactions. You understand that I can stop, breathe, and respond rather than react.
Yeah, I like that. I think, and I think one of the very important sort of practices that at least I try to implement in my classes is really boiling it down to the reasons, right? So oftentimes, I ask the whys of the whys, and I will keep asking the whys. And so I think my students have come to a place where they're like, well, why miss? Why miss? Why miss? Why miss? But I try to encourage that, because I think that sort of rationalizes why they feel a certain way, or at least they're able to sort of dig into that themselves.
Yes, which is wonderful. And that whole aspect of curiosity is encouraged, and that is also wonderful. Your classroom, if you're 7, 8, may be a little young to have my books read to them, but I have to tell you that one of the most powerful experiences of my youth was having my 2nd grade teacher read The Hobbit to us over the course of weeks. And so,
interesting.
You never know.
Yeah. I'm gonna keep a note of this for classes. All right, I'm gonna end with one last question, and I'll give you a chance to plug in some of your work as well. But for parents listening to this, or people that are planning for children, what can we do to sort of provide our children with a very sort of secure upbringing where they are well in touch and in tune with their emotion? What can we do to support our children when we do see them?
The number one thing parents can do is model positive emotional expression. And most people are like, what the hell does that mean? And I'm like, okay, so if you are escaping an emotion, that's a negative expression of the emotion. If you are lashing out, that's a negative expression. A positive expression is to take the emotion and express it in a way that doesn't hurt you or others. So maybe you paint a picture. Maybe you go running down the street. Maybe you scream for 5 minutes. Maybe you punch a pile of pillows. There are many ways to express emotion through art, music, writing, or some of those physical activities that allow the energy to flow without, like I said, hurting yourself or others. And that, if we can teach our children that, we have given them a huge gift.
Yeah, I really like that. And that would also mean, say, with your child, hey, I can see on your face you don't look very happy. Can you tell me how you're feeling? They tell you how they feel. Okay, let's do this together. Let's sort of punch it out. Let's get some pillows and let's start punching it out or something. So you sort of are not only doing it yourself, but you're doing it with your child, helping them release that emotion.
Yes,
I like
that is beautiful. And yeah, that's the best way. But also being aware of how you deal with your own emotions. So do you crack that bottle of wine at the end of the day after a long, hard day of work? Because that is a negative expression of emotion.
Right.
And so just being aware, and knowing that you as a parent or teacher can say, look, I'm having a bit of a hard time right now, and I need a minute to collect myself. So back off and I'll be with you in a minute. And that is modeling self-care. It's modeling that I'm honoring my need to express my emotions in a way that isn't going to hurt you.
Yeah, I really like that. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about some of the work that you're doing now?
Yes. About a year ago, I started co-hosting on a television show called Every Child Can Learn, and it's really looking at reimagining education of children, and it's an exciting show to be on. When you said that you're in China, I was like, oh, we talked about they use AI in the classrooms in some of the schools, and it's like bands that the kids wear on their heads. And in America, most people are like, what? But it's monitoring their attention and reporting to the school and the parents how much attention kids are paying to their lessons. So while there's perhaps benefit, that's a little bit big brother to a lot of Americans. But so I'm on that show and just as a co-host, but I decided to launch my own show called Children's Lives Matter. And it's really looking in depth at issues that children face. So like today I was writing the script for the show that will be on child sexual abuse and what parents need to know about that. And, how can they, what are the signs that their child might be abused, and how can they intervene, and how do they listen to a child? Because one of the biggest energies that children who are sexually abused experience is it okay for me to tell the other parent? Is it okay for me to tell my mom that her brother is abusing me? Is it okay? Is she going to believe me, or is she going to believe him?
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. And with this, do you interview adults who've gone through this when they were younger?
Yeah. My friend Melissa Osorio, going to be the guest on that show, and she has a book out called, it's Hidden Memories, I think is the name of it. But she was abused by her father from the time she was 3 until she was 16. And that led to really emotional disassociation from relationships. So, she didn't realize it, and she was like slowly going down in this rabbit hole of self-destruction. And she went in desperation and did an ayahuasca ceremony. That's when she realized that she had been abused.
Right. So that's so interesting.
She brings a powerful story to it.
Wow. I love this. Can't wait to listen in on this. Angela, thank you so much for
streaming.
It's streaming.
Streaming TV.
Awesome.
So it's available on Roku and
Apple nice. TV. Awesome. Thank you so much for being on this podcast with us. It's been such an honor to have you on the show.
Aw, thank you, thank you.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Joe Mills.
Chris Trzynski.
Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.